experienced veteran stage actor, and Hitchcock capped you to be the title role. What was the transition like from the stage, group theater, federal theater, Julius Caesar, and then coming to Hollywood and acting in front of the camera? Was that a major transition? How different was that for you?
Very different. It took me some time to learn that theatrics weren't necessary in front of the lens. You wanted to be much simpler. You couldn't do all your theatrical things in front of the camera. And it is told by Laurence Olivier that when he came to do Wuthering Heights, the director was William Wyler, and he said he learned to act in pictures from William Wyler, because William Wyler said, now, take it down, you're not doing Shakespeare. And so, in reply to your question, it required an adjustment to realize that this lens did much more work for you than standing on the stage and talking to the second balcony. That is to say, I was once in the production of Twelfth Night with Morris Evans, the Shakespearean actor. We walked into the theater, the Schubert in New Haven, at one time, and it had an orchestra, first balcony, and a second balcony. Terrific. Big theater. And he walked in, he looked at it, and just out of nowhere said, "Oh, a chin-up theater." That wasn't for a movie camera. And you had to learn that. If you say, what happens when you come to theater? There were wonderful actors in pictures who never were in the theater, but they adjusted. Yeah.
When you started out, describe or recollect for us when you first met and went to work with Orson Welles and John Houseman, and how that came about.
Well, that came about because I was on a federal theater project with Joe Losey called The Living Newspaper. And there was, and it was a living newspaper. It did the news on the stage, and it kept changing. It was very effective, and was considered a successful project. Another project on the Federal Theater at the time, and the Federal Theater was a great theater in its time. Another project was 891, that was the number of the project, and that was Orson Welles and John Houseman, and they were doing a classical theater, more or less, because they ended up with The Cradle Will Rock, which was, of course, as modern as you could get. But as events transpired, Joe Losey left the Living Newspaper, and then quite soon after, I decided to leave. And John Houseman and Orson Welles left the Federal Theater because the people who were running the Federal Theater would not let them put The Cradle Will Rock on the stage. It was censored. Production was blocked. And the rest is history. It's one of the great stories of the theater, the audience following them up Broadway until they found a theater in which to do it that night, the opening night. That's another story. What happened was, when Houseman and Welles decided to found this theater, they knew that I had left the Living Newspaper, and they invited me to join, which I did, and was in the very first production of the Mercury, and also the second, Holiday. And they had a very interesting part for me to do in Julius Caesar called Sin of the Poet. And that's how I joined, at their invitation, and suffered through their screaming matches at each other through many a boring afternoon.
Who the yin and the yang, Houseman and Orson? Was Orson the creative guy, and was Houseman more of the practical, or how did that relationship artistically?
More or less as you described it, although Houseman was very creative. He had, in the course of his lifetime, 7 theaters. He wrote a wonderful book and produced many pictures which many of you have enjoyed. So he had his own creativity. But in that setup within the theater, Orson was the creative one in the sense of directing and staging. And where Houseman was very good with Orson was in cutting scripts, particularly when they went into radio. They both were great. Houseman had, I remember, a grease pencil. It did terrible work. But the best work Orson ever did, in my view, was with John Houseman. And Houseman was a remarkable fellow, a great fellow, and so was Orson. But they came to a parting of the ways, and that was sad. They didn't see each other for 12 years, during which time Houseman developed his career as a producer, and in the course of that time, he produced Julius Caesar in the togas. When we had done it at the Mercury, it was in modern dress, modern Italian fascist dress, the green uniform. Mussolini was still in power. And the piece as done by Orson as a director was like a political melodrama that had been written the night before. It had such immediacy. This is why it turned New York right on its ear. It was a tremendous effect. But Houseman, when he made it at Metro, he made it with Calhoun, James Mason, Marlon Brando, and they set it in the toga time, in the Roman time. Picture was released. Not long after Houseman, after 12 years, entered a restaurant, and who should be there but Orson? And he sees Houseman, and he throws a sterno can at him. And he says, "You stole my play." I don't know what happened to William Shakespeare. You've got to have that kind of ego to live.
The young Orson, I mean, there's always been these two schools of thought in Hollywood, that Orson had so much trouble finishing pictures and then getting projects, and that was because of the studios not trusting him and being bureaucrats and everything. And then there's the other school of thought that Orson was prolific, undisciplined, walked away from stuff. And his greatest movie was made when he was in his 20s, and he spent the rest of his life either raising money or trying to live up to that standard. What's your opinion on Orson Welles and the rest of his post-Citizen Kane career?
It's a sad thing, because, in my view, he was the most talented director we ever had in the theater. In pictures, he was one of the most talented, because there were a couple of other fellows too. But it's a combination of elements. The greatest insight into Welles was John Houseman's. He knew him better than anyone else. And he once told me that there was in Orson a will for self-destruction that was very difficult to contain. And I think, in answer to your question, that will exercised itself, so to speak, over the entire career in one way or another. You see, when we were a hit at the Mercury, and we were all very poor, we were all off the WPA, it was 1937. I think the Mercury top was $2.20. So there wasn't much money in the box office. But it was known that after the show, Orson would walk out and go by way of the box office and grab whatever green bills he saw and put them in his pocket and go out on the town. After a while, they got wise in the box office. They just piled the dollar bills high, and the fives and the tens they hid. People out and see the big pile and grab the big pile. But that I cite as a sense of self-destruction. This was his own theater. He was doing that. And there were many other stories. So there is that. And also an interesting thing, maybe too personal to reveal, but Houseman once told me that Orson had a fear that when he went to sleep at night, he wouldn't ever wake up again. And somehow I have a feeling that affected him in some way.
Living
Some mysterious
in the
way.
moment all the time.
The way he lived.
In the moment, yeah.
In the way, the chances he took. The talent remained, but within the character. It's very hard to explain. Someone once said, it was Alfred North Whitehead, who was a very great philosopher at Yale and so forth. Talent is not that rare. Genius is not even that rare. But talent and genius are rare.